real pleased to have such a good crowd here today. As part of my introduction to our next speaker, I'd like to tell a really quick story. I grew up in Calhoun, Tennessee. That's my hometown, just north of here. And about 6 years ago, we had the opportunity to transcribe some old church records from a little country church, the Hiawassee Baptist Church, and they had their original records back to 1824. And in the course of that, there was a big entry for a memorial for a lady named Margaret Hanks Eifert. And in 1901, she had died. She had been a member of the church, but she had died in Webbers Falls, Oklahoma. And we had never heard of Webbers Falls, Oklahoma, for one thing, and didn't know the importance of her. And it kind of dropped. We didn't say too much about that. And so we didn't really go back and research her. But then, when I first met Troy Wayne, which would have been about 4 years ago, one of the first things he asked was, do you know anything about the Hanks family? And so I remembered her name from those old church records. And come to find out that when Troy Wayne was actually, I believe, still in high school and forming the Webbers Falls Historical Society, he was researching Calhoun all that time ago, and it seemed like such an ironic occurrence that we actually did have those records of the family that he was aware of. And so when he was visiting in Charleston and Calhoun about a year ago, I had the opportunity to take him to the Hanks family home site in that church. And then in October, when we were in Oklahoma for the conference, he took us to go see the Hanks family website, our home site in Webbers Falls. So it had come full circle. I just thought it's one of those stories that shows the importance of the research and about how it can really make a connection with it when you didn't even expect it. That was just something that had just kind of happened. And so we also visited some graves while we were out there, some people that had some Cherokees. She was Cherokee, and that they had lived there in Calhoun. When, in addition to founding the Webbers Falls Historical Society, Troy Wayne has served as the Executive Director of the Cherokee Nation Historical Society. He's a founding member of the National Trailblazeers Association. He currently serves as Executive Director. He served in Cherokee Tribal Government for over 20 years, including a two-term National Tribal Council member and as Chief Justice of the Cherokee Nation Supreme Court. Troy's an attorney, a storyteller, a public speaker, and he has an encyclopedia of Cherokee history underneath that turban. So, it is my privilege to introduce to you Mr. Troy Wayne Poteet.
Larry, am I on? I am. I won't have to talk loud today. Laura, thank you for a nice introduction. I'm really happy to be here. I enjoy Cherokee history, and so we've got a mixed audience. There are a number of people here who are very fluent in Cherokee history and steeped in it, and others not so much. So for the background, for the benefit of the latter group, I want to give a little bit of background. I think what I want to say to you is that, you know, often when we look at American history, United States history, the course may be, the book may be history up until the Civil War and then history after the Civil War, with a great deal of public fascination and enduring interest in that little spot in the middle, in the Civil War era. In Cherokee history, we look at Cherokee history up until the removal, and then Cherokee history after the removal, with tremendous interest in that removal era. You know, that all those things that happened, like the sheriff just talked about, which was really wonderful for me. This Treaty of New Echota that we're talking about today was executed by a very small minority group of Cherokee leaders without the sanction of the tribal council and in direct contradiction of a law that the leader of that group actually caused to be reduced to writing. It had been the Cherokee law for a long time, but at a strategic time, he advocated for, let's write this down and make sure everybody knows it. Nevertheless, he found occasion to violate that law. The United States Senate ratified that illegal treaty over the protest of probably 80–90% of the Cherokee people. People signed a petition in protest that would stretch to the back door back here in Cherokee and English. It fell on deaf ears. The United States Senate did what they wanted to do. The removal was at great cost. At great cost to the integrity of the United States. It's a stain on the honor of a country that we as Cherokees are very proud and patriotic citizens of yet today. But this is a bad chapter. Now, you're going to hear a lot today. You probably heard a little bit in the sheriff's presentation about Major Ridge, who was leader of the group who signed the illegal treaty. Major Ridge was considered to be the great Cherokee orator of his day. Today, we still have great Cherokee orators. My friend Dennis J. Hanna of Mosley's Prairie in the Going Snake District, and lately of Norman, where he's one of the leading bankers in the state of Oklahoma, is quite a Cherokee historian and speaker, and he's held many offices, the treasurer of the Cherokee Nation, the chairman of the board of our enterprises, which are huge nowadays. And Jay often speaks about tribal history, and very eloquently also. And in 2012, he spoke at Guntersville, Alabama on this Treaty of New Echota. And this is what Jay said. For scholars and students of removal history, it is a curious and inviting tangle of complex negotiations, personalities, circumstances, and alliances. A curious mix of compromise and conflict which culminated in the forced removal. Now, the Cherokee Nation is a family of families, and almost all of us are related somewhere back there. None of the signers of the illegal treaty were my ancestors or even my uncles. As close as they got would be some distant cousin, as far as I can tell. When Jay was speaking about this, he acknowledged that some of those signers were his uncles and his ancestors, his grandfathers, and also that he had ancestors in those opposed to the treaty. Jay said, I feel no need to defend nor to denigrate. They did what they did, feeling they were doing what was best for the Cherokee Nation. I think my remarks today, the way I'm presenting this, is because I feel like Jay did. I think that these people did what they did, thinking that they were doing what was best for the Cherokee Nation. And I'm kind of out on a limb here now. This can get to be a real touchy subject because many Cherokees don't feel that way. Lots of people feel that these signers were self-serving, arrogant, generally villainous, and that they were solely responsible for all the suffering of the removal. Some folks have been brought up to feel that these men were traitors, that they sold out for personal gain. Now, although I'm a very mild-mannered, shy, retiring altogether adverse to anything controversial. I do feel the need to try to see things from their perspective. And you say, well, why do you feel such a need? Because these treaty party people were leaders. They were some of the highest profile, most active people who were molding and shaping what was an illiterate group of villages connected by clan membership, by matrilineal kinship system, and by a language with a decentralized government. They molded it and shaped it and were positioning the Cherokee Nation to survive among the community of nations. They shaped it into a literate, constitutional republic with a widespread Christianity, a higher educational attainment than the people in the states that surrounded them, and a very prosperous Cherokee Nation where their tribesmen could develop at their own rate. They could acculturate and adapt to the pressing European population all around them at their own rate had they been given the opportunity. So these were the people who are often villainized as the treaty party. There were more than just the three people you hear about so much. John Ridge, Major Ridge, his father, and Elias Boudinot, his cousin. And then there's the younger brother, Stan Wadey, who was not as active at this time, didn't do as much to comment on. But anyway, there were a lot of other very progressive, intelligent people who decided to advocate for removal, but I can't talk about all of them in the time space that we have. I'll have to come back and do that some other time. So I'm going to talk about those leaders that are the highest profile. What I want to do also is examine closely the conditions that these leaders were facing, which culminated in what an eyewitness to the treaty signing called the Great Christmas Trick. What I think is that if we really look at it fairly and give it close consideration, a lot of people might think, as Jay and I have come to conclude, that they did what they did thinking that what they did was the right thing to do. So let me start by just talking about the life of, the great patriarch Major Ridge. Major Ridge was born in 1770, I'm sorry, what did I say? Thank you for the correction. I'll get everybody confused. He's born at that time. By the 1880s, when dragging canoe is way up here at Lookout Mountain. 1780. Okay. 1788, let's get that. He's riding with dragging canoe, and they're hassling old John Sevier. How many of y'all know who John Sevier is? Okay. The dreaded old Indian fighter whose son married a Cherokee girl. He married John Walker's sister. Anyway, no, John Walker's mother. Let me not get straightened off down that way. I'll get so tangled up in genealogy I'll croak. I'm talking about Major Ridge, and he's riding with dragging canoe. He fights with John Watts quite a bit during that 1790s period when there's a lot of conflict. And during one of these conflicts, they went to a place called Cabot's Station, where some white people lived, and they were making war on Cabot's Station, and the whites fought very valiantly, but they were losing, and women and children came out under a flag of truce. John Watts had sanctioned that. And while this is going on, there's a warrior named Doublehead who is belligerent, and most descriptions I can get kind of overbearing, but Doublehead ignores the leader, and he goes in and savagely slaughters women and children, and the Ridge got to see that. And he was not impressed with him, and from then on thought he was kind of a nutcase or something. In 92, he gets married at his village in Pine Log. In 94, there's a peace signed, so we've got a little tranquility for a while, and in 96, the locals see that he's some sort of a leader, this young chief, and they send him to council. And it's that same year at council that Doublehead gets elected to be the speaker. 2 years later, in 1798, there were 3 treaties made, cessions of land, and these cessions included reservations for Doublehead, his kinsman Talentiski, reservations at the mouth of rivers. They're giving up the land, but they're reserving some of it for their personal use, and this enriched them. And the Cherokees begin to suspect that they might be being bribed and not doing what was best for all the Cherokee people. Now, could I mention that this is off the subject of what's going on in Cherokee land, but in 1802, there's a compact made. The Georgians had, part of the colony of Georgia, the state of Georgia, included what's now Mississippi and Alabama. And their legislature, the governor, their politicians over there were trying to sell this land off to private land companies. Something about the Yazoo, and I could quickly get off into territory where I don't know very much, but suffice it to say from a Cherokee perspective, they got so tangled up in their own corruption that they had to let that scheme go, and they just gave it to the federal government with this provision. The federal government would get the Indians out of the state of Georgia as soon as it was practical and peaceful. And then the next year, Major Ridge had his son John. He already had a daughter Nancy, so he's got a growing family, and sometime he moved in there. Now, getting back on the treaties and the land cessions, in 1804 there was a treaty for Wofford's Tract, they called it. And this time the other chiefs, Major Ridge, Alexander Sanders, James Van, father of Rich Joe Van, this time they were certain that there had been a bribe given, and they decided, we're not going to have that anymore, we're going to fix this around. And they decided that under that old ancient law that prevented the cessation of property, that Doublehead had to go. Well, James Van, bless his heart, he had several wives, best I can tell, and one of them, her sister had been married to Doublehead, and Doublehead, while she was with child, had beat her to death. No justice had come out of that, and so James Van's wife was nagging him to do something about Doublehead, and so he saw the opportunity to do civil service for the tribe and also to get his wife to stop nagging him. And he volunteered, Sanders volunteered, so they started to go and get the job done. They were going to a place called Hiwassee. Well, James Van got sick, and Major Ridge got the honor of going to do away with Doublehead. So they got there. Well, Doublehead wasn't there. He had gotten a canoe and rowed up the river to a ball game, and they had to wait. Maybe they should have gone after him, because a lot of people were agitated and mad about this, and one of them was Bone Polisher, and he might have had something to drink, I don't know, but he started fussing at Doublehead at the ball play, and Doublehead killed him right there. Then he went to John Rogers' Tavern. That was a hotel, you know, kind of a bed and breakfast back in the day, I guess. So he goes to John Rogers. Well, I guess John was cooperative enough, but the thing is, they don't have any electric lights, and they don't really want to be seen. They don't want anybody to know particular who did it, although well, Major Ridge is going to shoot old Doublehead, but he has to have somebody to hold the light. To see to shoot him, so they went in there and held the light, and he could see where he was, but he couldn't see very good, and so Major Ridge shot him. And he and Sanders, they go off thinking, well, we've done the deed. And I can't remember where they went, but it wasn't long before they heard, probably at whatever they were put up, somebody came along and said, oh, did you hear? Somebody shot Doublehead, and he got away. He's run off. So now they've got to go track him down, and they tracked him, and they found him at Mr. Black's. There was a school teacher who was affiliated with Gideon Morgan, a missionary, and he got to Black's house and got up in the loft, and so here they come up in there, and I guess it's still dark, and they're wrestling around with him, and so finally the Ridge gets him off Sanders, and Sanders gets the axe and wham, right twixt his eyes. Now that gives new definition to Doublehead, y'all. And I mean, his old head was hard and thick, and old Sanders really got the job done this time. They didn't want to fool around with him no more, and he had to put his foot on him and use both hands to pull the axe out of that fool's head. Well, y'all, that pretty much wrapped up old Doublehead in his double dealing. So the old Indian agent, Miggs, and these minions that were being sent down by the federal government to try to get the Cherokees to treat away some more land, without Doublehead there, they went to work on old Black Fox, who was the chief. In the meantime, nobody really retaliates for the death of Doublehead. Instead, Major Ridge is elevated to the position of head of the Cherokee Light Horse. Now, the Light Horse at this time is a quasi-judicial body in that they go out to enforce the law. The Major Ridge is kind of the judge. He decides who's broke the law, what their punishment ought to be, and the Light Horse then carries out the punishment. So it's a very responsible, sensitive position that requires a lot of discretion. And it's a position of honor to be asked to do something, especially a kind of a younger chief like that. Well, the Ridge and his cohorts, it's pretty obvious to the Indian agent, old Miggs, that they can't do anything with them. So what they do is they hand pick who they want to come to Washington to treat. Now, some writers have referred to that hand-picked group as the river chiefs. Now, these are people who, like Black Fox, who's now the principal chief, and the Glass, and Talentiski, John Jolly, a lot of these people are related some way or other to Doublehead. But this group, they go up there, I think it's 1808 now, and they go up to Washington, and they're wined and dined, no doubt, and they come back to council that fall. And when they come back to council, they kind of feel like, apparently the people who studied it real close say, Black Fox thought that because he was the chief, and the chiefs did have some authority and some respect, and they were given some leeway, they were listened to. He thought he was just going to run this proposal to treat away the land through the council. But the Ridge was there. And the Ridge listened attentively, and he heard all they had to say. But the Ridge got up, and the Ridge said, "My friends, you have heard the talk of the principal chief. He points to the region of the setting sun as the future habitation of this people. As a man, he has a right to give his opinion. But the opinion he has given as chief of this nation is not binding. It was not formed in council in light of day, but was made up in a corner to drag this people without their consent from their own country to the dark land of the setting sun. I resist it here in my place as a man. As a man, as a chief, as a Cherokee having the right to be consulted in a matter of such importance. What are your heads on your bodies for but to think, and if to think, why should you not be consulted? I scorn this movement of men to unsettle the nation and trifle with our attachment to the land of our forefathers. Look abroad over the face of this country, along the rivers, the creeks, and their branches, and you behold the dwellings of the people who repose in content and security. Why is this grand scheme projected to lead away to another country the people who are happy here? I, for one, abandon my respect for the will of a chief and regard only the will of thousands of our people. Do I speak with the response of any heart in this assembly, or do I speak as a free man to men who are free and know their rights? I pause to hear. And what he heard was a resounding, yes, we will not go. Reject the treaty. It was very loud and very plain. Black Fox, he got unchiefed right away. His brother, or his Talentiski, whatever kin he was, he moved out west. He treated the next year and got gone. And Major Ridge had stepped up another notch in Cherokee Nation building. Now, at this time, let's move up, a year or two later, 1811, and the river ran backwards. There was this big earthquake in the Mississippi. It ran north for a while, and it scared a lot of people. And Tecumseh, the prophet of the Shawnees, who I think had Creek kinfolks, he came down. He was trying to unite all the tribes. And now I'm not directly comparing Tecumseh to Charlie, but there was this old prophet, medicine man sort of guy way up in the mountains, and he comes down into this part of the country with this message. He said, all the Cherokee troubles are because y'all aren't living like Cherokees anymore. You're behaving like these white people, and what you got to do is reject all this. You got to kill all the cats and get rid of these frock coats, get rid of these mills, get rid of all these utensils and all this way of living like the white people do, and go back to the way we lived before they came. And by the way, anybody that dares to contradict me, the Great Spirit is going to strike him dead. And a lot of people were awfully nervous. And the Ridge jumped up and said, well, strike away, because I don't believe any of it. And we're not going back. We can't go back. We have to move forward. And Major Ridge raises himself another notch. The next year, the United States puts out a call for soldiers. They need help because they're afraid the British might invade. So the general up to Knoxville sends down to the Cherokees. I think Grandfather Hicks may have still been the chief at that time, and he takes it to the council, and the council, John Walker and the Ridge, you know, John Walker we heard about just an hour or so ago, all these guys say, yeah, we're going to ally with the United States, we'll help out, we can raise 500 or 700 troops. Now when they put this together, the Ridge only got the rank of lieutenant because he didn't speak English. But by the time these conflicts are over, he's raised up to the rank of major because of his outstanding leadership. In 1815, a volcano erupted in Indonesia, I think's where it was, but it caused climatic changes and it caused the corn crop in 1816 to fail. And that worked in favor of old Jack Skinner, old Jackson, who was not president yet, thank God. He was down here traipsing around trying to get Cherokees to sign land away, and it was easier to get somebody in the notion of signing land away because the tribe was in debt. We didn't have enough corn to feed everybody. I know all this because Dr. Riggs back here researched this and brought this to light, by the way. So, 1817, you know, he's making all these proposals to the Cherokee people, and the Ridge was the leader of 65 other chiefs who said, you know, what you're doing is fraudulent, the way you're trying to get us to make this treaty. Nevertheless, another treaty was made, another cession of land was made. And these younger chiefs are getting very, very adamant that we just can't do this anymore. Now let's move up a few years, and it's about 1822-3, somewhere along in there, the great genius Sequoia comes up with a writing system for the Cherokees. Now, many of us continue to believe that that writing system was indeed a great gift from the Creator, and it was, Sequoia was just the chosen vessel from which it came, because he's the only man who ever lived who was able to invent a writing system out of his, just out of his sheer intellect. By 1827, John Ridge, who has been sent off to missionary school, he and Elias Boudinot, and they go back up east, up into New England, and they have this big school for tribal people, and it's a good deal, but, you know, they wound up causing the thing to be shut down, you know, because it was one thing to educate Cherokees, but to marry one was something else, and these two white girls decided to marry these Cherokees, and they burned them in effigy, and the result of it was that the mission school, this great college, shut down. But at any rate, he and Elias both have come home to serve the people, and Elias, now this is Major Ridge's nephew. He's busy, they're trying to interpret the Bible into Cherokee and all this kind of thing, and he's on a speaking tour back up in New England, raising money for a Cherokee press, a printing press. That same year, United States agents, now they're kind of arrogant, they just set up and say, we're going to have a meeting, y'all all come. And the chief said, maybe you ought to ask us when to schedule it first. So they didn't go. That same year, the Cherokees got together and had a constitutional convention at New Echota. And at this constitutional convention, they adopted a tripartite government with the different departments. It's not exactly like the United States, but somewhat. The basic scheme. This was then published. The first issue of the new Cherokee newspaper carried the Constitution in English and in Cherokee. And by the way, there's a clause in the Constitution that says we have the sovereign right to govern the lands, and they describe the lands which were left them after the last treaty in 1819. Whoa, my God, the Georgians had a conniption fit. Oh, these Indians, these savages can't have a sovereign country within. So they get busy and they pass a law that says, you Indians, you just have temporary title to this property. Now the fall in, that was 27, in 28, it comes a long time. The Ridge was the speaker under that provisional government, but they had sure enough full elections in 1828. Uncle William Hicks gets resoundingly beat by John Ross. Some people said he was the only one that didn't know he couldn't be chief. But John Ross is the chief, and Major Ridge is not the speaker. Going Snake becomes the speaker of the council. Major Ridge is, it's like a cabinet. He's like a secretary. He's a counselor to the chief. There's about 3 people who were chief's advisors that in our equivalent in the United States would be the presidential cabinet. Anyway, and when they have council that year, he gets up and gives one of those spellbinding speeches, which the main message was, hold fast your lands, we're not giving up any more land, and Andrew Jackson is elected president. Now, I want to, this election of Jackson president is, it emboldens the Georgians who are already agitated that these savages, who can have a higher literacy rate than they do, I might add, but anyway. So one of their state legislators, I think he's later a congressman, David Meriwether, wrote to General Jackson, we want Cherokee lands in Georgia, but the Cherokees will not consent to cede them. And here's what old Jackson said. You must get clear of the Cherokees by legislation. Take judicial jurisdiction over their country. Build fires around them, and do indirectly what you cannot affect directly. So Georgia, they pass a law that says all Indian residents within the boundaries of the state of Georgia would be under state jurisdiction in 6 months. Now, Jackson's got old John Eaton up there, his old buddy, and you know, he's married a barmaid, and it's just none of the ladies in Washington want to associate with him, and so I guess he appointed him Secretary of War, and he sent some guys out here to begin to persuade the Cherokees, and Jackson can see that the church leaders are going to say this is wrong, so he gets a big-time church guy named McKinney and appoints him with the express purpose of, you got to get these church people to hush up and don't give us so much trouble. And by the way, gold was discovered in them Cherokee hills around Dahlonega. Now I'm going to move up to the cold February in 29. Now, while John Ross is gone to Washington to see what he can do about Georgia's going to extend their laws over us, Major Ridge and John Ridge are out giving speeches and rallying the Cherokees to stand fast. Don't let them bribe us. Don't let them do anything else to us. We got to get together, and we can't give up any more land. And of course, Elias Boudinot's using his position at the newspaper to do writing, besides spread the gospel and help the Reverend Wooster and a lot of other good work. Now that fall, these Indian people, or the agents, are all out here trying to get Cherokees to sign up to migrate. And to give you an idea about that, well, I'll say this. Alexander McCoy, one of my ancestors, he signed up to have his property appraised. That's kind of preparatory to going. And Major Ridge and the others who were opposed said, we can't have that going on here now. That won't work. And so at council, he gets unelected as the secretary of the council. And not only that, here is what John Ridge wrote, because he took Grandfather McCoy's place, and he said they passed a law, and it said, whereas a law has been in existence for years but not committed by writing, that if any citizen or citizens of this nation should treat and dispose of any lands belonging to this nation without special permission from the national authorities, he or she shall suffer death. Now, Major Ridge didn't get that. He advocated for that from his new position. He wasn't a legislator at that time. And it was pretty evident that, you know, when Jackson got up to give his first message to Congress, he was speaking to the Congress and saying, he spoke of the faith that surely must await if the Indians didn't remove. And about that time, Major Ridge, who usually went about in a suit all dressed up, put on a buffalo head deal and goes out and runs intruders out. Jackson had a pretty good grip on the Congress. By the spring of the next year, the Indian Removal Act passed. And that summer, the Secretary of War issued orders that no gold could be mined out of the lands around Dahlonega in the Cherokee Nation. And they also said, and by the way, that annuity that we faithfully promised to pay you Indians, we ain't going to pay it to you. Here's how you get it. We're going to give it out to each person, can get 40 cents apiece. You got to come 180 miles to get it. And what's that all about? That's about making sure that the Cherokees don't have any money for legal fees. Elias Boudinot had to go up on a speaking tour and raise money so the Cherokees could pay William Wirt, a former Attorney General, to take their case and take it to the United States Supreme Court. In October, at New Echota, John Ridge was elected president of the National Council. And Grandfather McCoy was reinstated. I guess he repented of wanting to move west. In December, the missionaries within the Cherokee Nation got together and got organized, and at that same time, the Georgia Guard was organized. 40 men were appointed to the Georgia Guard, and their stated purpose was to enforce Georgia law over the Cherokee Nation. And in 31, they passed a new law that said white people had to have a permit to be within the Cherokee Nation. Now, what's that about? That's because the missionaries were raising a cry. They were saying, this is wrong. They're corresponding with the mission boards back in New England and places, trying to drum up support in the Congress for the Cherokees. So, in February, the Reverend Wooster, who's a great missionary who had labored among the Cherokees for many years, he was referred to as the one sent. His wife had a new baby daughter, and in February and in March, here comes the Georgia Guard and arrest him and one of my white grandfathers, Thomas Gann, who was married to a Cherokee woman. And they hauled them off. Now, they make bond, and they turned Wooster loose because he was a postmaster. But, you know, they came back in July and arrested him again. And in the meanwhile, in April, this is the kind of stuff that Georgia was doing. A group of the Georgia Guard, some of the most savage, sad tales I believe I've ever heard are about the Georgia Guard. But they come upon a Cherokee baptismal ceremony, and what do? They ride their horses down into the water on top of the people participating in the baptism and say, by God, we're going to baptize our horses too. July the same year, the case gets to the Supreme Court. It doesn't take as long then as it does now. You saw the sheriff talked about that earlier. The Supreme Court of Cherokee Nation, case of Cherokee Nation versus Georgia, and the Supreme Court said, golly, we couldn't think of a case that incited more sympathy than the mess that you all are describing, but you don't have standing. You're not a foreign country, you're not a state, you can't bring a suit, Cherokee Nation. You can't bring a suit in our court under the Constitution. You're a domestic, dependent republic. Now, it goes along with that, the language that Joe showed us earlier. They did have a right to govern themselves within their own territory. But, so, right after that decision, there had been that same council that met the October before had appointed a delegation. Richard Taylor, the Chief Ross's nephew, William Shorey Cootie, and John Ridge to represent them in Washington. And so they went immediately over to the White House to talk to the president about what's going to be done now that this decision's come down. And what he said was, I'm disposed to do you good. I'm a friend. And he reminisces about his work at the battle of the service of the Cherokees with him at the Battle of the Horseshoe Bend, at which place they made his career. You know, they helped him win the battle and establish him. And he said, you know, I don't blame you for filing your case, but I do blame you for allowing these lawyers to fleece you. Then he went ahead and talked about the British Treaty of 1783 and talked about the Catawbas and reminisced about how at one time the Catawbas had dined on barbecued Cherokee innards. That's some good White House conversation for you, though. And this is what Jackson told them. Cherokees will, you know, he talked about the once powerful Catawbas and how they were now poor and miserable, and said, Cherokees will thus be if they remain surrounded by whites. I cannot interfere with Georgia law to protect you. Well, they went home. The missionaries then had their trial back in Georgia. You know, these missionaries that were arrested because they didn't have a permit, they hauled them into Georgia court and convicted them all. And it wasn't just missionaries, that was the printer and this ancestor of mine, Tom Gann. 10 of the guys said, okay, we give. They recanted, Georgia let them sign some documents, and they agreed to get out of the Cherokee Nation, and off they went. But the Reverend Wooster and the Reverend Butler said, no, we can't do that. That would be unconscionable. We have to stay the course. And so the next year, you know, the same lawyer took their case again, and he's working on the case. Meanwhile, here's where it gets really bad. In 32, the state of Georgia created 10 counties across the top of the Cherokee domain. They set up a lottery system. 85,000 people registered for lottery of 18,160-acre parcels of the Cherokee Nation. 133,000 people registered for lotteries of 35,000 40-acre tracts up in the gold belt where gold had been discovered. And I'm going to read you from an article in the Cherokee Phoenix about what it was like. Fortune drawers of our land have been passing and repassing single and in companies across inhabited lots. Georgians roved in search of the splendid lots which the rolling wheel had pictured in their imaginations, cheerfully asking Cherokee residents which parcels they were occupying. All these people swarming down on the Cherokee Nation. Well, Elias Boudinot, John Ridge are back in New England trying to raise money. When the news of the decision came down, now this is late in the year, and the decision was in favor of the missionaries. The decision said that, golly, the state of Georgia does not have a right to interfere. They're supposed to be, so. And what did General Jackson say at the White House? He said, well, that decision falls stillborn. The Cherokees are going to find that they can't coerce the state of Georgia into complying with it. As soon as that kind of word gets to John Ridge, he hastens down to the White House and goes in and asks the president, just point blank. And the president told him, and most earnestly advised him, to go home and advise his people that their only hope of relief was in abandoning their country and removing to the west. Told him point blank, I'm not going to enforce this decision. I'm not going to do anything about it. You're at the mercy of the Georgians. Now that, the people who described that described the countenance of John Ridge when he heard that as one of melancholy, because he had put so much faith in the integrity of the United States government, in justice, and it had all come to naught. The sad truth began to dawn on him that there wasn't a way Cherokees were going to be able to survive there under these conditions. By the winter of 1833, the newspapers around the Cherokee area were advertising maps. People had invested in drawing maps so that you could find your way into the Cherokee Nation. There were lawyers swarming around. There's always got to be them if there's anything. Land speculators, and the great Governor Lumpkin, when he made his address to the Georgians at the end of the year, here's what he said to the General Assembly in Georgia, that the state now had settled freeholders across land hitherto the abode of people wholly unqualified to enjoy the blessing of wise government. And I want to share with you Sam Houston, Governor of Tennessee and Texas, so forth. I want to share with you what he said about these people who were so unqualified for self-government. Of Major Ridge, he said, in point of native intellect, he was not the inferior of any man. About his son John Ridge, he said, he was not inferior in point of genius to John Randolph. That's Thomas Jefferson's relative that helped keep the state of Virginia together. Now, let me see. Well, I don't have very much time to share with you some of the atrocities that were going on, but I'm going to share one or two. Now, this is from Jeff Bishop's book, where he just quotes Cherokees and other people, just quotes about the, and this is from Uwahis Tahi. I had in my possession houses, farm and fruit trees in the old nation. In about 1833, I was turned out of my house by a white man who claimed the lot on sections of the land I resided on, and in consequence of my Cherokee neighbors being also drove from their places, I lost everything entirely. The bread said, in the year of 33, while working in the gold mine in Georgia, I was seized, assaulted, and imprisoned. I was not aware at the time of any existing law prohibiting persons from working in the mine. Katu said I was knocked down with a gun by the Georgia Guard, the marks of which I carry on my head to this day, for no other reason than digging gold in my own country on my own land. Y'all, it was under these conditions that the Ridges began to advocate publicly for removal. Because Elias Boudinot would not go along with John Ross saying, no, don't express those opinions, he was replaced by my Uncle Elijah Hicks as the editor of the newspaper. In 1834, the next year, a treaty was discussed. It was at that meeting that the sheriff discussed earlier, at which Tom Foreman bitterly denounced Major Ridge's reversal, denounced all the people supporting him, said, you stamped your foot and told us to stay here. Now you've changed your mind. We're not having it. We don't want to go. And they veiled threats of violence against them. That same year, John Ross began to raise some cases in the Georgia courts, but that just kind of put things off a little bit. Lumpkin appoints this guy, Bishop, to just go out and put people in possession of the Cherokee holdings. And so, where did they go? They went to John Ross's house while he wasn't home, went in and told his wife they'd come to take her place. She wouldn't acquiesce, and they picked up a dresser, started hauling it out, going to destroy her stuff. She finally signed some kind of paper, and they let her stay in the back room till John Ross got there and took her on up into Tennessee. Same thing happened at Rich Joe Vann's house, the big house at Chatsworth, Georgia, that James, they came there. The brother of the Georgia Guard wound up in possession of that house. They threatened to burn it down if Rich Joe didn't give it up. And so this stuff went on all over the country. A couple of the treaty advocates were just murdered in August. You know, they weren't big leaders, just. So they had a council again in October at Running Waters. And the two sides get together, and John Ross finally agreed, okay, let's send a delegation of people to Washington and we'll treat. Now, we're rejecting this offer of $5 million. So John Ridge thinks, okay, finally he's going to treat before we're completely destroyed out here. And a delegation's picked, and it comes time, and they are on the way to Washington. And on the way to Washington, now he's not really part of the delegation, but he's going up there to keep an eye on them. And the chief wants him to come and show support so they can be unified. And he gets a newspaper. And in the newspaper, John Howard Payne, who wrote Home Sweet Home, he has come along and written what purports to be an address from the Cherokees to the American people, and the address says, golly, we don't want to move. We want to take allotments and be citizens of the various states. And all this removal talk is just because the United States is bribed, induced a few people to tell lies about removal. And when John Ridge saw that, he immediately gets in touch with the chief, and the chief, no, come on up there, blah, 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 because he can see John Ross is not going to go up there and treat. He's going to continue to shuffle his feet, and the Cherokee Nation is going to continue to be overrun. But he did. He went on to Washington, and he stayed until he figured out that, by golly, this is just not going to happen, and he went home. And so in December, John Ridge and quite a number of people, there was a council called, but John Ross said to all of his supporters, nobody go to that meeting. And the Treaty Party people were at that time, they were just in despair that they were going to lose the whole country. And so they agreed to treat. And I want to share with you, I'm running just a little long, but I want to share with you what Major Ridge said to the people who did gather. I know the Indians have an older title than the Georgians. We obtained the land from the living God above. They got their title from the British. Yet, they are strong and we are weak. We are few, they are many. We cannot remain here in safety and comfort. I know we love the graves of our fathers. We can never forget these homes. I know, but an unbending iron necessity tells us we must leave them. I would willingly die to preserve them, but any forcible effort to keep them will cost us our lands, our lives, and the lives of our children. There is but one path to safety, one road to a future existence as a nation. The path is open before you. Make a treaty of cession, give up these lands, and go over beyond the great Father of waters. Old men cried, patted the ridge on the back and said, we'll go. Here's what Elias Boudinot said a little later, referring to all of that threat that we heard from Tom Foreman at the council before, and the fact that none of the Ross people came. No, these braves are not here. Their places are vacant. Ross has induced them not to come. They are at their homes with the loud thunder. They will come again. I know I take my life in my own hands, as our fathers have also done. We will make and sign this treaty. Our friends can then cross the great river, but Tom Foreman and his people will put us across the dread river of death. We can die, but the great Cherokee Nation will be saved. They will not be annihilated. They can live. Oh, what is a man worth who will not dare to die for his people? Who is there here that would not perish if this great nation can be saved? They executed the treaty. And Major Ridge said, I have signed my death warrant. After that, it wasn't long until he was quoted again as saying, I expect to be killed. The provisions of that treaty provided the Cherokee Nation the land base that we now today call our jurisdictional area. If you look on a map, It also included that strip as wide as the Oklahoma Panhandle all the way across northern Oklahoma, a perpetual outlet to the sea. The treaty called for a representative in Congress. It called for payment of monies. It was the treaty that was rejected in 1834. So I ask you to reflect. What would have been the situation for Cherokee people if they had continued, if no treaty had been made? How long could they have survived? Could they have survived? What was the alternative? What was going to happen? Considering all the conditions, what alternatives were there? I'm not standing here saying I have those answers. I'm just asking those people who are enamored of Cherokee history to reflect on that and think about that. And let's have opportunity to talk about that. I think in many years past, these people have just been villainized, and we should rethink at least that. Thanks for your attention. Hope I haven't run over very long. 6 minutes, you all. Thank you.